everyone, and welcome to our next presentation. It's wonderful to have you all attending today. The presentation we have is from ProPharma Group, and they will be discussing the synergies between US and Europe medical device registration. So Jan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Becky. And then I'll start sharing my screen. So give me a second. Put it in presentation mode. So I trust that you all can see my my screen now and the presentation in presentation mode. Now, I've been listening this morning and this afternoon, and there has been an awful lot of information shared about investors in startups, in companies, in developments. So apparently now we're going to switch to something different. We're going to step into more the regulatory arena. And although I say it's going to be different, on the other hand, I think that this is what it is about, because now we're going to talk about added value, and that means the value of your company and your product. And the more synergies we have, the more efficient our development projects, the earlier you have proof of concept, those kind of things. So I trust that this is all of the interest of investors, but you as a startup entrepreneur as well. So here we go. So we're going to talk about, obviously, about the synergies. And that also says that we also talk about differences. And trust me, there are quite a few. Not going to be able to do all. So therefore, we're going to focus on things like clinical data. Now, we're going to walk you through it. What we will cover is planning your development activities so the documentation and generated data can be used in submissions. The more you do that, obviously, the more efficient you are and the earlier you might be able to get your product to the market. Key considerations when planning FDA submission straight from CE mark. So what do you have first? Do you have the CE mark first, and then do your FDA submission, or vice versa? And what are the pros and cons? And then an integrated look at clinical strategy to fulfill RA needs in both EU and in the US. Now, first a bit of recent history and changes. Now, I trust you all know that we went in Europe from the Medical Device Directive to the Medical Device Regulation. And I'll touch on that in a minute. But also in the US, things change. So there has been a CDRH reorganization, and actually they also will look more at pre and post market functions, and that actually means that also FDA will look more and more at clinical data. So there is an increased communication between regulatory and compliance, also quite important, and an increased scrutiny on post-approval study completion. Again, emphasis on post-market surveillance, and that means clinical data. And that's what's stated here. Recent changes to FDA PAS program includes the PAS needs to be agreed upon after PMA approval. FDA aims to complete within 60 days of the approval date. So there's a whole program around this. And FDA focuses therefore also here at clinical data. And apparently, also in the US, and in a minute it's going to be clear why I mentioned all this, sponsors need to prepare and submit post-market surveillance plan to the FDA. And they obviously review that, and the study must begin no later than 50 months after the order has been issued. So there's, from the FDA, emphasis on post-market surveillance programs and again, clinical data. Now, I already said something about the medical device regulation. I trust that quite a few of you are familiar with that. It was published, as you see, in the code name of the regulation in 2017, and the Medical Device Directive was repealed this year in May. And now there's a little, if you do just a little trick, and you take the PDF file and you just start to search for a couple of keywords, you see that in the Medical Device Directive, the clinical evaluation has been mentioned 13 times, and in the MDR 138 times. Clinical benefits, the same type of increase. Clinical evidence wasn't mentioned in the directive at all, but is mentioned in the MDR. And also there a significant increase, and in all the other ones as well. That means that in Europe, we went from a bit of emphasis on clinical evidence to quite a bit, or to a significant amount of emphasis and focus on clinical data. So we need to have more and more clinical data. And we need a bit more than that. So on one hand, we have the regulatory requirements. So in your documentation, in order to prove that your device is doing what it is supposed to do and that it is safe, so the regulatory data, you also have to have a couple of other things in place in your organization. So if you are the manufacturer of a device, and that means also the party that designs it, you have to have a quality management system in place that takes care of risk management, clinical evaluation, and in the G line you see I've underlined design and development, and last but not least, setting up, implementation and maintenance of post-market surveillance activities. So the regulation forces you to have a quality management system in place, at least in Europe, but also in the US. And therefore, if you are a startup company talking with investors, it might be a good idea to have this already in place, because that gives also investors, but you as a developer, the milestones in hand that you have to achieve in order to be able to progress, to continue development your development program. Since we talked about similarities, but perhaps also some differences. If you take your development program and you look at that and you think about your development strategy, and you have identified that you focus on one or the other region or both, it is good to be aware that there are, or there will be, common specifications in the EU that give you direction for your specific product or product group. And there are also in the US regulation number specifications, recognized consensus standards that are also helpful for your product or product type. Now, that means that when you start your development program, it may pay off to investigate what is already available in the European arena and also in the US arena regarding guidance documentation. Because if you follow those guidance documentation, or those guidelines, your entire development program may be optimized for one or the other region, or perhaps, and that's even better, for both. And now I step again back from regulatory aspects to quality management system aspects. Quite often, regulators talk about design controls. When you design your product, you have to go through a standardized design strategy or pathway, and that is being identified in the QSR, that is the quality system requirements of the US, part 820, and more specifically 820.30. And in Europe, if you focus on the European market, you have to follow the well-known ISO 13485 2016 version, and there we talk about clause 7.3. Now, the nice thing, as we talked about similarities, is that the Code of Federal Regulations, the quality system requirements in the US, is actually based on an old version of the ISO 13485. So if you investigate in the quality management system requirements, you're going to recognize that requirements for both regions are basically the same. So if you develop your product according to ISO 13485 clause 7.3, you cover, let's say, for 90% or 95% also the requirements for the US. And here you see that in a bit more detail. So the stages, if you go from A to J, are actually entirely the same, apart from the fact that the red text makes, how do you say that? The text without the red parts is the US text, And if you include the red text, then you get the entire text of the EU requirements. So that's basically the same. And for both regions, you go through the input-output phase, etc. By the way, quite often we see that, if I go back one step, that companies that are further developed, so more mature, are very well aware of these requirements. Quite often we see that for young startups, they are still in the what I tend to call the R&D phase. So they're still playing around and optimizing their device. They may lack the appropriate design controls and should consider that the implementation thereof at a certain moment in time. If they do it too late, they run the risk that they have to repeat certain activities, and that would be a pity. Another thing, if you design for either for Europe and or US, there are good things and bad things about the EU. Everything is confidential in the EU, so it is very difficult for you to find out what your competition is doing. However, that is not the case in the US. In the US, you have the PMA and 510K databases where you can find all the products that are on the market in the US. And not only that, you can also find the summary of the 510K or PMA. And that includes, for instance, the intended purpose, intended use statements. So as an example, if you start to design for Europe, but have also plans to go into the US, it may pay off to search those databases and see what alternative similar devices are claiming, what their intended use is, and perhaps you could copy that intended purpose. And if you do so, you might be getting closer to a product which is already on the market, and that may simplify your registration. And I think that a simpler registration is having a higher chance of success. And now I started talking about added value that will definitely add to your value of the product and company. Now, part of those processes, of course, include clinical validation. So you go through your design process, you have to perform clinical studies to collect your clinical evidence in the end, either for the EU and or US. Little sidestep on that. Clinical evidence is not necessary, or clinical studies is not necessarily the same as a clinical evaluation. Your clinical evaluation is a process that starts from the moment you start designing, and throughout your design process, you evaluate clinical data that you get from literature, from your own studies, from previous marketed devices, and obviously your own medical device. And at the end of the evaluation, you consider the safety and performance data, and you can conclude that it is okay to submit or that you have to conduct another clinical study. This is the start of your clinical development and your clinical validation. Now, obviously, you have a plan and report pre-market, and during the post-market phase, you have your life cycle management. And also in that situation, your clinical evaluation report is updated, and that is being updated via your periodic safety update report, which contains the data of your post-market surveillance activities. This is a terrible slide. It has way too much text. And that's why I've underlined two terms. First of all, what you see here are the chapters that you need to have in your clinical evaluation plan. Be aware that there is a continuous conduct. As I just said, you don't only do that during your development phase, but also during your post-market phase. And one of the chapters in your post-market clinical evaluation plan is your clinical development plan. In your clinical development plan, you can also call that your clinical your strategy that identifies the studies that you need to conduct in order to complete your clinical data. So in your clinical development plan, you have addressed what what kind of clinical data you need to have. Now, not necessarily in the regulation, but it's very good to identify if you start your clinical activities is who the stakeholders are. Now, obviously, it's regulatory affairs because you want to have a CE mark or you want to have a 510K or PMA. But in addition to that, you also have investigators that you may want to satisfy because the investigators want to publish. Your product design team, because they need to have input in their product design. They have to change something or not. Sales and marketing wants to make brochures. We plan for success, so sooner or later you get your market approval. And then sales needs to have brochures. Your company, because the company is benefiting from a successful clinical study. Again, think about added value. And think about the regions in the world, which you need to satisfy from a regulatory perspective. Always be aware, why are you doing the study? It's not that you just do a study because you have to think about what clinical data you need. And then obviously, once you get closer to your CE mark or market approval, which kind of post-market clinical follow-up activities do you have to employ? Now, considering your clinical data, as I said, it is driven by your clinical evaluation process in the EU. In the future, consultation is possible. At this moment, you cannot call the notified body and ask what you have to do. Yeah, you can call them, and then they probably won't give you an answer because they are not allowed to. In the future, there's going to be consultation groups available. There's no such thing as a clinical evaluation process at the FDA, but you can consult with them. And discuss what you need to do. But in that case, be prepared. Never go into the FDA with an open question, because then you have to adhere to the answer. Back to some focus on the EU. The clinical evaluation plan, post-market surveillance plan, post-market clinical follow-up plan are the things that are identified in the regulation. You must have those. And in the end, you update your design documentation, and that is being stored in your Annex 3, so in your technical documentation. And on the right-hand side of the boxes, you see the deliverables. This is the this is the sequence of the plans that you need to have. Obviously, when you're just in your development phase, you only have a clinical evaluation plan, your post-market surveillance plan, and the rest will get there once you get closer to receiving the CE mark. Same picture, a slightly different way of presenting it. The horizontal line is your development phase, and then the circle is your life cycle. But you see the same terminology. You have your evaluation plan, you have your pre-clinical evaluation report, or your first version. Then you do a clinical investigation, or not, if you don't have to. And then you have your final clinical evaluation report, which is the base for your CE marking. Then you have your post-market surveillance, PMCF, trending analysis, PSUR, and you update your clinical evaluation report. Now, what kind of PMS data do you have? You have your literature searches, so you still look around you, what is available in the market. So you are forced to investigate what is being out there. On top of that, in your clinical evaluation, you also determine the state of the art. So what is currently acceptable, and based on what is currently acceptable, you have to show evidence that you meet that market acceptability. Now, based on that, you determine your endpoints, your design of your study. You look at the quality of the data. So if you do a literature search and you only find a single-arm study, for instance, and a randomized clinical trial study, then obviously the quality of the randomized controlled study is higher than the single arm. That's something you have to report on. And last but not least, if you do a clinical study, the medical device regulation forces you to use harmonized standards if they are available. And for GCP medical devices, it's the 14155. Be aware of that. If your study doesn't meet that standard, is not in compliance with that standard, you may have to explain something. The whole process, and again, that applies for both regions in the world, ties in with risk mitigation. But I also like to bring forward one other thing, and that is your product development capacity. And why am I doing this? Well, you have only a certain amount of capacity available. And when you draw up your clinical strategy, as we just heard in the previous session, you have to consider where you're going to conduct the study. Do you want to go to the US first? Do you want to go to the EU first? And apparently, even within the EU, some countries are picky about where the study was conducted. You can be very brave and have an endless capacity and say, I'm going to develop my product for both regions, or for even more regions, if you like, at the same time. That means that you have to be ready for each and every regulatory questions or requirements. And typically, because companies sometimes are restrained in their capacity, it means that you just delay your first product launch. Because if you combine the EU and the US, you have to just do more for regulatory activities. And that means that your first release is going to be later than if you separate that. The other thing, and that's what I meant in this case for risk mitigation, the sooner you can go to the market, the sooner you have input from the market or feedback from the market. And that means you learn from your market. The earlier you get feedback, the smaller the risk. If you invest a lot in getting to both markets at the same time, you put a lot of money into your company without having, or with a later return on investment. If something goes wrong, your financial risk is higher. So probably it's wise to consider your design risks, but also look at your product development capacity. So a couple of options. One market. If you go from one market only, you need less capacity for design purposes, but you may need more capacity later on. If you do it for both markets simultaneously, then you need just more capacity, as we just mentioned. And with the first option, I meant if you do one market first and do the other later, then your total capacity requirements might also be higher. Now, obviously, stating the obvious here, if you do a staged approach, you start with one market, but you have an eye out already for the other, you can optimize your capacity and your capacity utilization, and therefore also optimize the data that you are collecting. So here again, one market, no plan for the other, speed to market, early revenue. But again, if you go to the second market and you didn't consider that yet, you invest then you invest again as if you were going to a new market. Both markets simultaneously. So as I said, potentially later to the market, and staged approach, earlier market access, and data can already be collected for the other market. So let's consider a clinical study. If you do a clinical study here for EU, that might be very wise. That data might be used as input to your discussions with the FDA. If you want to do that, consider then also what you need as early data for the US. I can also turn it around. If you do a clinical study here, get a CE mark here, you follow up with another study in the US. That study in the US can be used as post-market clinical follow-up data for your EU registration. Notified bodies accept that. I see that I have a little repetition here. Consultation possible with the FDA. Sometimes the clinical programs in the US are longer. And therefore, but also require more patients, and that means that it might be more costly. Notified bodies, yeah, there is currently limited capacity, so you may need to consider at an early stage if you go for EU first. The good thing is we have more notified bodies than only one, and the consultation we already mentioned. So clinical strategy, and as I said, think about your sequence. if you take an integrated approach, but still do it sequential, you start, for instance, as an example, in the EU, you start to collect data here that you can use also for US purposes. So a study done here can serve as a pilot study for a pivotal in the US, and the pivotal and the data from the US can serve as a post-market clinical follow-up study for the EU. That kind of clinical strategy may pay off. In that, if you take those considerations, or if you make those considerations, you may reach a very efficient, cost-effective clinical collection program. So in summary, upfront considerations of target markets. So think where you want to go and when and how. So which one is first? Consider not only your device, but also the experience you have and the capacity that you have. An integrated approach may pay off. So one market follows the other. And a well-designed clinical development program is essential, because collecting clinical evidence can be a more than considerable part of your clinical or your product development activities, as I also heard earlier this morning. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jan Bart. We've literally got like a minute left, so we're not. Yes, it's okay. So we're not going to be able to have time for any of the questions, unfortunately. But I would encourage everyone to reach out on the platform and answer. So Jan Bart can answer any questions that you have. There was also a lot of really informative information in that, so I'm sure lots of you do have questions. So apologies that we couldn't get to it, but reach out on the platform.
My mistake, huh?
It's all good. There was a lot to get through. So, but reach out on the platform, make those connections, and hopefully we'll be able to answer any questions that you do have. But for now, that's all we have time for. It was a pleasure to speak to you, Jan Bart, and to listen to that presentation. And we'll speak to you all very soon. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Becky. Bye-bye.
Bye.